Great, thank you. Can you hear me? All right, awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Crowley, Bennevis Crowley, for official purposes. And I'll be giving a presentation today on the work that I've been doing over the course of the last 3 years on energy communities providing grid services. So the motivation. As the EU transitions to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050, a lot of things have to change. One of those things is the power system. And on one side of the power system, we have more renewable energy sources being integrated into the system, which is of course more sustainable, but comes with the downside of being intermittent because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. On the other side, we have distributed energy resources, things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, batteries, things that will consume energy and increase electrification and come with flexibility, which are all positives, but on the downside have some increased consumption, which can lead to congestion problems throughout the grid. And these distributed energy resources, a lot of them are being brought into the energy system at the hands of smaller consumers. In light of this, the European Union in 2018 defined the concept of energy communities. These energy communities are groups of citizens that have the primary purpose of environmental, economic, or social community benefits for its shareholders or members, or for the local areas where it operates. So for my PhD, we wanted to see how these energy communities can help support the grid, and we come to the question of how can energy communities provide grid services to support the green transition. This was part of the Flex CEC project, which was the flexibility from citizen energy communities, which was funded by EUDP, and it had the aim of unfolding the potential of CECs in Denmark and to harness the flexibility available in those citizen energy communities. Today, we're going to look at 3 different research directions. Firstly, we'll look at transmission system services, then we'll move on to distribution system services, and lastly, we'll take a look at learning prosumer behavior within these services. Firstly, transmission system services, a brief overview. Currently, we try to meet the intermittency and potential faults in the grid through auxiliary services. And in the Nordics, there's a set of services that, when combined, can do a good job of trying to meet these potential intermittencies or faults in the system. What we look at is how an energy community can combine, through a community manager, to bid into these different markets. So the question that we ask ourselves in this direction is, can an energy community bid into the Nordic auxiliary service markets and reliably deliver services while considering various sources of uncertainty? In this direction, we've published paper A, and we'll show that the 2 contributions that we've made in this direction are, firstly, that we've developed a 2-stage stochastic program that can determine an optimal bid into the Nordic auxiliary service markets based on provided historical data. And secondly, we conducted an out-of-sample analysis which shows that we can meet the pre-qualification requirements of the Danish transmission system operator with a sufficiently large number of in-sample scenarios. Moving on to research direction 2, at the distribution level. What you can see here is a small distribution grid in Denmark, actually where Jalal lives. And so all of these blue dots are houses, and this yellow dot is a transformer that provides those houses. And what you can see in the small plot below is the orange line is the maximum transformer capacity, and the blue lines are both the maximum load and the average load throughout a day over the course of the past 2 years. And what we can see here is that in January 2024, we got quite close to that maximum capacity, and in January 2025, we're even closer. We can imagine what might happen in January 2026 if another house installs a heat pump or another electric vehicle. That transformer might be above its maximum capacity. And Denmark is not the only country with issues like this. If we look at other countries like the Netherlands, this is the medium voltage level that we see. All of the red areas are where we already have limited available transfer capacity, and we're adding additional consumption will be problematic. So there's multiple countries where distribution level capacities are becoming problematic with time. What we'll ask ourselves here is, can an energy community deliver a distribution level capacity limitation service while guaranteeing desirable economic properties for the community and its members? We've published paper B in this direction, and we'll demonstrate that our contributions are, firstly, that we demonstrate that an energy community has the potential to deliver a capacity limitation service in response to dynamic prices. And secondly, we designed some constraints and objective function terms to consider desirable economic properties and fairness endogenously during the price setting process. The last research direction we'll look at is learning prosumer behavior. The idea here being that we might not know what assets or how people use assets in their daily life. And so over time, we want to learn and adjust our knowledge, our distribution, to learn what assets are relevant and which ones disappear over time and aren't actually relevant for a consumer. So our goal here is to learn what assets they have and how they use them. So our question in this direction is, how can we implement an algorithm that learns the underlying preferences of community members while delivering a grid service to the DSO? So we're looking at the distribution level. And in this direction, we've submitted paper C, which is currently under revision, and we've actually just received the first review and are working on it. The contributions here are firstly that we implement an algorithm that integrates bi-level programming and Thompson sampling to learn consumer preferences. And we demonstrate that this algorithm has the ability to learn prosumer behavior with strong regret performance while learning to deliver a good service simultaneously. Diving into the first research direction. We're looking at transmission system services. And then the big question here is, how do you actually bid into these Nordic auxiliary service markets? When you use your electricity throughout the day, you're here on the day of operation. This is when you produce electricity and you consume electricity in real time, and also when the system has to be supported through auxiliary service activation. So if something goes wrong, if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. However, to bid into the auxiliary markets, this happens the day before operation. Also before this, but the most important bidding happens the day before operation. At this point, as an energy community and as a transmission system operator, we need to make sure we have reserves to support the grid if something happens in real time. So the day before operation, an energy community bidding into these markets would have to make a few decisions. Firstly, what markets do we bid into? What capacity should we be bidding into these markets? And lastly, how can we ensure 90% reliability and meet the so-called TSO P90 requirement, which asks us to be able to deliver our reserves in 90% of activation cases. We have two types of decisions that we have to make here. One is the wait and see decisions. So that'll be happening on the day of operation, and the here and now decisions, which are the decisions we have to make when we bid. To model these wait and see decisions, we generate scenarios. So we make decisions here and now, and for all the possible uncertainties that we might see in the second day, we generate scenarios. These are based on historical data and to represent the possible realizations of this uncertainty for the wait and see decisions when we make the here and now decisions. And we have a two-stage stochastic program to make these decisions. Now, moving on to the results, what happens when we bid into these markets and what markets do we decide to bid into? What we can see on the right here is a plot where throughout the hour of the day, how much capacity do we bid into which market? And we see that the bidding of the energy community is focused in the frequency containment reserves, FCRN and FCRD. The amounts vary throughout the day, but over the course of the day, they're approximately equal at around 50% and 47% respectively. Another thing worth mentioning is that FFR, the fastest service, is actually not bid into. And when we look at the underlying price structure of the markets, this is due to the historically lower prices that were used in the available historical data when this model was conducted, when this study was conducted. And lastly, we see that the manual frequency restoration reserves, which are the longer acting markets, are only bid and delivered in the evenings when community members are home to react and actively shift their load themselves rather than through batteries or automated systems. Now, the interesting part here is we want to see how we do if we have unseen scenarios that we have to react to, right? So that was the results. If we have a set of scenarios and in sample, that's how we should bid. We want to know how that bid would do in a set of scenarios that we haven't seen before. If uncertainty is realized in a way that we didn't expect while optimizing, what happens? So what we compare here is when we increase the number of in-sample scenarios on the x-axis, how do we perform out of sample on unseen scenarios? And what we see is that as we increase the in-sample size, our out-of-sample feasibility increases. This is continuous, not in a straight line. We can see this logarithmic curve. And then to meet this P90 requirement, so to be activated in 90%, to be successfully activated and offered a reserve in 90% of the cases, we have to use more than 100 samples. At 100 samples, we're here at 87.5%, which actually meets the 5% buffer that the TSO allows. But to be safe, we should be using just above 100 scenarios to be able to meet this 90% requirement for unseen scenarios. The last thing worth mentioning is that at large sample sizes, the improvements only become marginal. Once we move past 500 scenarios, if we double the size all the way to 1,000 in-sample scenarios, we only gain 1.5%. So that additional computational burden might not actually be worth it. So finding a number somewhere between 100 to 500 scenarios that we believe works is sufficient to meet this P90 requirement. So to summarize research direction 1, can an energy community bid into the Nordic auxiliary service markets and reliably deliver services while considering various sources of uncertainty? Firstly, we showed that through this two-stage stochastic program where we have the here and now and the wait and see decisions, we can determine an optimal bid into the Nordic auxiliary service markets, which will be based on the provided historical data. And secondly, we showed that by using enough in-sample scenarios, the community can meet the 90% requirement of the Danish transmission system operator. Moving on to research direction 2. We now move from the transmission system services down to the distribution level, where we saw that we're meeting transformer limits in some cases. I've tried to illustrate here what we saw in Jalal's neighborhood, where we have a set of houses that over some piece of grid infrastructure will at some point exceed the limit. And this could impact both the larger grid, but also other people connected to the same feeder. Now, we need to find a way to limit this peak to stay below our orange capacity limit, the orange infrastructure limit. And what we propose here is that we combine this group of prosumers that is behind this point into a so-called energy community and offer them discounted grid tariffs, so they have to pay less for the usage of the grid in return for curbing their maximum capacity at a point in time and stay below a capacity limitation throughout the day. So this is what we're aiming to do and how the service that we propose we implement in the research direction 2. To do so, we've developed a framework to provide this capacity limitation service. We start, again, on the day-ahead basis, where we have the price release at around latest 2 p.m. in the Nordics. And based on these price forecasts, the DSO will forecast some sort of congestion. This congestion forecast tells us, do we actually need to limit the capacity throughout the day, at what times it could be necessary, and how much we would want to limit the capacity of the community. And then these contract parameters would be shared with the energy community. This would be things like how much discount will they be offered, what is the limit throughout the day, and what penalty they should pay for exceeding that limit if they do exceed it at some point. Now, based on these parameters, the community manager will set dynamic prices for each community member. These dynamic prices are meant to coordinate when people use their loads such that we stay under that capacity limit throughout the day. Once the community manager has optimized those prices, they share the prices with the relevant community members. And then lastly, once those have been shared before operation, this has to happen before we reach the operational day, the prosumers then determine their optimal schedule and consume based on those dynamic prices on the day of operation. And yes, so what do we mean by dynamic prices? You're all familiar with static prices. These are prices that are constant throughout the day, the same for everyone, and only change kind of over a longer term horizon. Think about supermarket goods like milks or eggs. Then moving on, we also have time dynamic pricing. This is something quite commonly used in power systems at this point in time. For example, wholesale markets where the prices vary throughout the day based on consumption levels and production levels. And also, we're still looking at the same price for all prosumers, but they also differ every day, those prices. And then lastly, what we aim to use in our work is time and space dynamic prices. So not just prices that change every hour throughout the day or at a certain time interval throughout the day, but also differ for every prosumer that's getting a price. So both of our prices would change throughout the day. Yours might be higher at a different time than mine, so that we induce people to consume or produce at different hours throughout the day, thereby meeting our capacity limit. It's important to note that these dynamic prices are again set the day before, so we're not setting these prices in real time, but rather we set them the day before operation. And people will use them then throughout the day, and they won't change again once they've been set. Now, to model this, we use a so-called Stackelberg game or the leader-follower problem. As you saw in the framework, we have the community manager who sets prices first, who's then followed by the consumption and the scheduling of the prosumers. So in this case, one way to model this would do to set those prices iteratively, where the community manager sets a price, sends that price down to the prosumers. They can then tell the community leader, this is how I would react, and then you can iteratively set a price based on when you both are satisfied with both the prices and the schedule. Another method to do so is to consider this follower's problem while already making the leader's decision. And so we use a bi-level program that aims to include the model of the follower inside the price-making decision of the leader. Thereby, we don't have to go through this iterative process, but we consider the optimality conditions of the prosumers inside the pricing already made by the decisions made by for the decisions made by the community manager. So, what does the structure of our problem look like, and what is the goal of the problem? Firstly, our objective is to minimize the community cost. This is consumption, import and export from the grid, also the tariffs that we're paying. And just generally, we're trying to minimize what the community pays for power throughout the day. And then this is, of course, subject to some constraint. Some more basic constraints are the internal network constraints, making sure that we don't exceed limits throughout the day. And secondly, the grid service constraints, which is how much the penalty for exceeding and things related to the capacity limitation service that we're providing. Additionally, something we implement in our pricing problem is two constraints for desirable economic properties. Firstly, the individual rationality constraints, which constrain that each individual member in the community will be better off joining the community than outside of the community. And secondly, the budget balance constraint for the community manager, which ensures that the money that they gather from the prosumers and the community members is equal to what they have to pay to external stakeholders who require payments. In addition to this, we have the lower level problems where we use the optimality conditions that we implement into the upper level problem. And we have perfect knowledge of their objective, which is to minimize prosumer cost, and then also their asset constraints and demand constraints. And this is the problem that we use to set our prices on a day-ahead basis. Now, how does this look? Do we actually manage to deliver a capacity limitation? The first case we see here is if all community members don't use any flexibility. If the solar assets were to produce when they produce, if the batteries weren't used, what would happen? And so what we can see here is the black line, which is the capacity limit. And we see that we exceed that limit in the evenings, but also that we have available solar power in the middle of the day that could be used to try and meet that limit in the evenings and also in those morning hours. A second case, which we look at, is the uncoordinated flexibility usage. We can see here the capacity limit again, but we have massive peaks now in the morning, but also some large export peaks in the evenings. Notice here that the Y scale has changed significantly and that the peaks are 4 times larger in the uncoordinated flexibility use case than they are in the residual demand case. Now, what we all want to know, of course, is what happens under the dynamic prices. And we do a much better job of adhering to the capacity limit. We don't do so perfectly, but we have by far the lowest peaks here in the morning, only going up to just under 3 kilowatt compared to almost 50 in the other case. And we adhere to the capacity limit in most hours, the only issues being in the early morning hours and the evening. And this is due to the efficiency loss when using the battery to shift load between hours. Now, if we look at the community cost, we want to look at the impact of the contract parameters, right? We've seen that we can get closer to meeting that capacity limitation, but how does the cost change when we have either a more changing limit throughout the day or an increase in a discount? So we have on one side here, the tariff discount, so how much they're being offered by the DSO to meet this capacity limit, where 0 means that there's no discount, they have to pay full tariffs, and 1 is no tariffs at all. They're getting their internal network usage for free. And what we can see is that with more tariff discount, the community cost decreases. Quite logical. Now, the other thing we investigate is what happens if the capacity limitation changes throughout the day. We saw in the plot that had a slight variation throughout the day. And what we investigate is if it doesn't change throughout the day, so a variation factor of 0, so it's a constant static limit throughout the day, compared to a capacity limit of 1, where it's varying at a high level throughout the day. What happens? How does that impact the cost of the community? And we see that the more we vary the limit throughout the day, the worse it is for the community. So we actually perform better when we have a static limit throughout the day, because we have to shift less power from certain hours to other hours. And the battery efficiency doesn't have as large an impact on the residual, on how much load we have to shift. Moving on to endogenous promotion of fairness in the price setting. You'll recognize the price setting problem from a few slides ago. We also additionally introduce some objective function terms, for fairness promotion. So what these terms do is we add a very small weighted factor where the aim is to distribute the benefit that the citizens get fairly throughout the community. And so we have two different mechanisms that we propose. Firstly, the equal distribution mechanism, which is quite simple in that everybody should receive the same amount of benefit. And then we also propose the proportional distribution mechanism, which is that the amount of benefit that they receive is proportional to the residual load. So how much power they would have to meet throughout the day. So it's their consumption minus their production. It's important to note that these mechanisms and this fairness can't be considered at the same time. If you want to consider them, you have to solve them separate cases. So we have one case of equal, one case of proportional, and one case of not considering it at all. Now, how does this impact the fairness distribution? What we see here is a case study with 14 members and 3 different cases, where one is where no mechanism is considered. The middle case, the purple case, is the proportional mechanism, and the right case is the equal mechanism. And what we see is that fairness promotion is successful for the prosumers with positive residual demand. So people that have to have extra load that they have to meet and have to import throughout the day, these mechanisms manage to make either it equal or proportional, where you'll have to trust me here that it is actually proportional with the residual demand that they see. But we also see that additional distribution mechanisms must be developed for prosumers with negative residual demand. We can see that there's a few cases here where there's no impact across the different cases. So there's still work to be done here with how we can make sure that both prosumers with positive and negative residual load can both be considered fairly in the optimization problem. So to wrap, sorry. To wrap up research direction 2, sorry. Can an energy community deliver a distribution level capacity limitation service while guaranteeing desirable economic properties for the community and its members? Firstly, we showed that an energy community has the potential to deliver a capacity limitation service. We didn't do so perfectly, but the potential is definitely there. And we can do this in response to dynamic prices. And secondly, we showed that desirable economic properties and fairness can be considered and promoted endogenously during the price setting process, but there is still some work to be done in this direction. And lastly, moving on to research direction 3, learning prosumer behavior. Firstly, what do we actually mean by learning? So the things that we might not know about prosumers in an energy community are things like what time a prosumer may be at home to shift load, what flexible assets and production do they actually have in their homes? Do they have any flexibility available? What temperature do they keep their homes at? How are their heat pumps and things like that constrained? And also things like, do they even have an electric vehicle? And if so, when do they use it and when is it connected to the grid? So a lot of learning methods use large historical data sets to try and learn these things. The problem is that with a lot of this personal data, large historical data sets aren't available or just don't exist. So what we propose is that we move away from static learning where we learn from one large data set, but rather learn while we gather data over time. So move into an online learning framework where each day when we're able to observe how people are reacting to prices, we can learn something about their behavior and then do so over multiple iterations until we feel we have enough knowledge about their behavior. So to do so, we need to change the model of our prosumers. Before, we had a single model where we had a set of asset constraints, a set of demand constraints that we assume are perfectly known and that everyone wants to minimize the prosumer cost. What we now do is that we move to an aggregate model of multiple signatures. So a prosumer's household profile is now an aggregation of multiple different signatures. And each of these signatures represents a power schedule for an asset or a different way of using such an asset. So if we look down below, one could be the production profile of a solar panel, another could be using a battery for flexibility. But also it could be someone that uses their electric vehicle in the morning versus someone who uses their electric vehicle in the evening. Same with heat pumps. Do they like their house warm or cold? Do they have a large acceptable temperature range or a small acceptable temperature range? Things like that. And then each of these signatures receives a weight. And that determines how prominent that signature is within that person's aggregate demand profile, household profile throughout the day. So one of these signatures might have a weight of 0, meaning it's not represented at all. They might not have a solar panel, so then it gets a weight of 0. Others might get higher values because they are present within that household and do define their household profile. It's important to note here that we still assume perfect rationality within each signature, and that each signature still has the aim of cost minimization throughout the day. Now, how do we use the online learning framework, and how does it even work, and what is the Bandit framework? So the Bandit framework starts with a set of initial knowledge about prosumers. This might be, we might know some assets, we might know absolutely nothing about them. But then from here, we're still aiming to use dynamic prices to meet our capacity limit. So we would set some dynamic prices for the prosumer. We would observe the response from the prosumer based on those dynamic prices. We update the knowledge that we have about that prosumer's assets and behavior. And then we start an iterative cycle of setting new prices, observing more response, and updating our knowledge continuously as we go to get better and better information about each prosumer. Now, in paper C, we use the so-called Thompson sampling algorithm, which is a Bayesian-based algorithm to do this learning. And so our knowledge is represented by distributions of unknown parameters. And so in this case, we have the weights of each signature that are unknown that we're trying to learn over time. So we start with some initial distribution of what that value of the weight might be. We sample a value from that distribution to set dynamic prices. We observe the response, and we update our distributions according to Bayes' rule, depending, of course, on which distributions we're using. And then, as you might have guessed, we start iterating here and continuously updating our distributions until we approximate our values well. To try and visualize this, in an early iteration, you might have a true value of the screen value. That's what that our distribution is trying to converge to. But our distribution is quite uninformed, right? It's quite broad, and we could be sampling a lot of values that might not actually be the true value. Then, as we go over iterations, that distribution will slowly converge until hopefully by the end, we've gotten to a distribution that approximates this true value quite well, so that when we sample a new value now, it is very close to the true value. And our optimization here is using values that are close to the true value and what we want to learn. So now we're going to dig into how we actually set this price again, right? So looking back at paper B, this was the bi-level problem that we set up, right? We still have, it's changed slightly. We don't consider fairness in our objective function in this paper. And we no longer have the internal network constraints, but we do still have the grid service constraints, individual rationality, and budget balance. And now the big difference that happens here is that we move to a case where we have multiple problems for each lower level prosumer. Each problem represents one of the signatures that we saw before. So in this small illustration here, we have 3 problems and 2 prosumers, right? That could, of course, change that number. This is just arbitrary for the example here. Now, what we don't know is the weights for each of these problems, right? So theta represents that weight, and we're trying to learn the weight on each of these lower level problems. And so each one of them is assigned a true weight that we don't know, where we converge our distributions over time. And then 2, look at the aggregate profile. We add a constraint for the weighted signature aggregation in the upper level to anticipate this response from the lower level. Now, how does this perform? Do we manage to learn over time? What we see is that we achieve near zero regret over time. So what is regret? Regret compares this daily community cost from the learning algorithm to a clairvoyant price setter. So someone who has perfect information, who knows those true values, how would they perform compared to our learning algorithm? And so what we see here on the right is that in the early days, we have quite some regret, which increases, but later on, our regret stabilizes. And so we show that after about 100 days, we reach near zero regret. You can see it's quite close to linear throughout these last days. And what we also can see is that all independent runs achieve near zero regret. So there is a certain range depending on how poorly we sample in those early iterations while we're learning, but all iterations do manage to achieve near zero regret in the later stages, so after day 100. Now, do we actually converge to the correct values, or are we just learning something useless? What we see here is 10 different signatures that we've used in our case study and the distributions. And so on day one, we can see that the distributions are all quite wide, and there's a lot of possible values we could sample. And we're trying to learn this true weight, the red lines in each case. So on day one, we're not doing very well. By day 5, you can already see there's been significant changes, some distributions converging faster than others. What we can see here is that these 4 signatures highlighted in the box have actually converged to the correct value already by day 5. And these are the highest power signatures. These are our electric vehicles and our battery, which have high power usage in individual hours. And then as we move forward, by day 25, there's an additional 2 signatures that are converged quite closely. And by day 100, all of our signatures are within a small distribution that approximate this true value quite well. And so we can see that all of our distributions have converged towards the correct value by day 100, which matches our regret curve quite nicely. Now, does the community actually follow the capacity limit that we're trying to follow? On day 1, as you might imagine, we don't. We do very poorly. We don't have much knowledge about the community, so of course, the prices that we send do a poor job of meeting the capacity limit. Whereas if we had perfect information, we would be able to meet it. Now, moving on to day 5, we already are doing a much better job. Like we saw, we've learned those high power signature values correctly, and so we still exceed the limit or get very close to the limit in some hours, but the major spikes and deviations are gone, and we're following the limit much better than we were before. By day 25 and by day 100, we see that we are meeting the limit. We are meeting the limit throughout, which matches our convergence that we saw, right? So we actually managed to meet the limit almost perfectly with a slight deviation in the first hour. By day 25 and day 100, we're meeting it perfectly. Now, the question is, what happens if these weights change? What if after 150 days, suddenly someone starts using their car differently, or someone buys an additional electric car or a heat pump? What will happen? So what we've done is we've simulated a change in the subset of the signature weights after 150 days. What we can see here is that if we don't do anything, the algorithm actually performs quite poorly after 150 days, right? So if we change 100% of the signatures, 80, 60, 40, or 20, doesn't matter, we don't get back to the same regret performance that we saw from day 1. Now, what we propose is that we know our algorithm can learn. Why don't we just reset our distributions once we detect this change happening? And what happens is that we manage to actually regain that strong performance, even with 100% of the signatures changing. The weights changing for 100% of the participants. And we managed to regain the strong performance that we saw before. So to wrap up research direction 3, how can we implement an algorithm that learns the underlying preferences of community members while delivering a grid service to the DSO? We showed that we can implement a learning algorithm that integrates bi-level programming and Thompson sampling to learn these consumer preferences. And we also showed that this algorithm has the ability to learn prosumer behavior with strong regret performance while also learning to deliver a grid service. So to wrap up our 3 research directions, in paper A, a more broad conclusion that we can draw is that energy communities can reliably support grid balancing by bidding into the ancillary services in an optimal manner. So there is an opportunity there for energy communities to become involved in ancillary service bidding and provision. In research direction 2, we saw that desirable economic properties and fairness can be integrated into the price setting problems, while still enabling an energy community to support the distribution grid and deliver this capacity limitation. And lastly, we saw that integrating bi-level programming into the Bandit framework shows promising results for understanding consumer behavior while quickly learning to deliver grid services. And so a more general conclusion that we can draw is that energy communities can play an important role in supporting the green transition and the green transition of the power grid in Denmark, and hopefully also beyond. Now, of course, there's still more research to be done in this area. And so from some future perspectives to consider, both for the energy communities, DSOs, TSOs, and regulators. Firstly, how do we improve the scalability for real-world applications? Some of our methods have quite large problems, and we've used quite small case studies. You saw 14 prosumers and 25 in the case of paper C. Energy communities shouldn't be limited to such small numbers. So how can we improve the computational performance of our algorithms to be able to scale this into the real world and apply it for larger communities? Secondly, we assume perfect rationality throughout our work. What happens if we work with bounded rationality? So if people don't make perfectly rational decisions and only want to minimize their cost, or also want to consider risk or something in their decisions, how can that impact our findings? Then how can we balance the trade-off between ensuring privacy for consumers and learning their behavior in the community? Should we be considering a trade-off in this area, or should we just be able to learn everything about the prosumers and the community members? And then lastly, it would be nice to combine paper A with papers B and C to provide the distribution level services while simultaneously trading the ancillary services that we saw in paper A, right? So how can we both deliver the capacity limitation service as well as the ancillary services simultaneously? Then from the DSO side, our papers B and C rely on good congestion forecasting from the DSOs. If they have a poor forecast of where there will be congestion, our capacity limitation service won't do much. So then the question becomes is how can we improve that congestion forecasting and pricing and thereby optimize the incentives for the community as well, and just make sure that these capacity limitations have the impact we want. On the TSO side, how can we streamline the pre-qualification of these energy communities for ancillary service provision? And historically, ancillary services are coming from larger assets where you have to pre-qualify one larger power plant. If an aggregated set of members, like an energy community, is going to be delivering those services, that's a lot of individual assets that might have to be pre-qualified, and a lot of individual people that would have to be contacted. So how can we streamline this pre-qualification and make sure that energy communities can gain access to these ancillary service markets? And then lastly, our case studies have been very focused on the Nordics and Denmark. And so the question becomes, how can these proposed methods be integrated into other national legislations and grid codes? Do other countries also have high tariffs that can be used to incentivize this? Or do we need to reconsider maybe the incentive structures in the capacity limitation service and such other considerations? On that note, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. And yes.